Well, hi, everybody. My name is Matt Lawrence. I'm an associate professor of law at Emory University School of Law, and I'm actually coming to you from the past. I'm recording this on Tuesday, and my wife is about to give birth. So Friday morning, I'm either not going to be able to make it or I will not be able to make complete sentences. And the editors at Duke were kind enough to let me pre-record this. I want to say thank you to all of the other presenters, to the conveners, to the editors. This has been a fantastic symposium experience. I can't believe how quickly and thoroughly the editing process went, but let me dive right in. My topic is Congress's domain, appropriations, time, and Chevron. I'm going to make two, oops, that was an accident. I'm going to make some stray highlighting marks, but I'm going to make two core points. The first is a descriptive point. I'm going to talk about appropriations, and I'm going to say that we should divide in our minds between annual and other short-term appropriations and permanent and other long-term appropriations when we're thinking about the separation of powers, because annual appropriations preserve a domain of congressional power and permanent appropriations shrink that domain. I talk a little bit more about that distinction and where the lines are in the paper. I won't go into it now, but that's my core point descriptively. Annual preserve separation, preserve congressional power, permanent shrink. And my doctrinal recommendation will be that while courts have taken varied approaches to Chevron for appropriations, I'll recommend they disfavor deference for permanent appropriations, but not for annual appropriations. And that's going to be in light of their very different roles in the functioning of the government. So to start things off with some grounding, with the frame, anyone attending this conference knows that the Schoolhouse Rock version of the separation of powers is two-dimensional, although very interesting. And one important dimension that you have to add is the fourth dimension, is time. Oftentimes, Congress and the Senate, maybe with the president, maybe over a veto, they create a statute that then is entrenched there on the statute books and empowers an agency. It's a delegation that empowers the agency far into the future. 30 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later. This is why Guido Calabrese suggested courts take away some statutes. I'm not going to get into that. The point is, when we teach administrative law, we sometimes wonder, what is the future role for the Congress, for the House and the Senate? What is the future check on agencies once they're empowered? And that's where appropriations come in, because appropriations actually preserve a really vigorous area of congressional oversight. Here is the appropriations power for annual and permanent appropriations, but I know there's a lot there. I want to start you down here at the bottom, at the key, if you look at the bottom left, with a really fundamental distinction in appropriations law between authorizations and appropriations. So an authorization is just what if you're not in appropriations, you just think that's the law. It is a law that empowers an agency or requires an agency to spend. We call that an authorization. And because of the appropriations clause, an authorization is not alone sufficient to allow the agency to spend under the Constitution. The Constitution requires an appropriation, which requires you name a source of funds, there's a purpose, there's some other requirements I talk about in the paper. The upshot is that Congress can create an authorization that even requires an agency to spend, but not appropriate the funds, and instead appropriate them 1 year at a time. And in that case, the Congress actually has to appropriate the funds for the agency to comply with the law. That's a fundamental distinction. And what that allows is that oftentimes, if you go up here to the this top left box, oftentimes Congress creates a statute in permanent law that permanently authorizes an agency to do something and gives it some power, but it appropriates funds for the agency and for the program 1 year at a time. And that winds up giving the agency that kind of enduring influence to administer the program, but also future Congress's influence, because both the House and the Senate now can unilaterally block funding. They get a veto, an appropriations veto over the agency's funding, because they're both necessary every single year to fund the program. And that allows Congress to watch over what's happening pretty closely, because the agency's worried not only that next year won't get funded, but there might be a reduction in its funding. It preserves this area of congressional influence and oversight over agencies. That's what annual appropriations do. At the same time, though, flip over to permanent appropriations. A permanent appropriation provision gives the agency power to spend constitutionally without congressional approval going forward. It's on the permanent statute books. And that's basically giving all of the power to the agency, and that leaves the House and the Senate out. The permanent appropriation takes away from Congress that ability going forward to threaten the agency with reprisals through the appropriations process. So that's all what I mean when I say that annual appropriations and permanent appropriations play contradictory roles in the separation of powers. So what does that mean for Chevron? Like I said, courts have taken different approaches to Chevron for appropriations. I think to understand Chevron for appropriations, we need to decouple two things Chevron's doing. So another picture, and again, start at the bottom left at the key. I just want to focus in. When Congress creates a delegation, there's actually two kind of authorities going with that delegation. The clear law is empowering the agency, but by default, the ambiguity in the delegation empowers courts because they get to interpret the ambiguity. So that's our default, top left. Straight line, clear law, delegation empowers agency, but squiggly line, the ambiguity empowers the court. But with Chevron, what happens, of course, first thing that happens is now that the agency interprets rather than the court. But a second important thing happens when you apply Chevron, which is that you take away stare decisis. You take away the solidifying effect of that first interpretation. So instead of courts deciding, but then locking in their interpretation, we have agencies get to interpret and they can change their interpretations. And that's really a separate effect from deciding who interprets, deciding that the interpretation can't be sticky because, of course, the agency can't change it. The Biden administration can't change the stickiness of its interpretations. The next administration will be able to change them, and so on. So what that means when you put it all together is how Chevron works with appropriations is starting up with annual appropriations, not that big a deal, but a little awkward to refuse Chevron deference for appropriations. Not that big a deal because no matter what, when it comes to the ambiguities in appropriations, the House and the Senate can watch over what the agency does, and they can punish misinterpretation, bad interpretation, whatever. They can punish things that happen that Congress doesn't like. They can punish that through the appropriations process the next year. So there's this ongoing congressional oversight in the annual space that makes the role of courts less important. Also, annual appropriations are very transient, hard for judicial review to come in. So I won't dwell on that, but I do have some thoughts. As for permanent appropriations, much bigger deal because those go on the books permanently. And whenever Congress gives away some of its power through a permanent appropriation, Chevron for that increases the gift. It shrinks Congress's power even further. And that's what I have that here. And it does a second thing, and this is what I want to focus on, at least in this talk. To this point, you might be thinking, I'm suggesting annual appropriations good, permanent bad, but I'm not suggesting that. There's a really good reason for permanent appropriations. The strongest reason is stability. You want a permanent program. You need people to rely on it. Something like new property that can't be dependent on the annual congressional cycle. That's the best reason for permanent appropriations, and that reason is undermined if we apply deference to permanent appropriations. Because if you apply deference to permanent appropriations, it means that the meaning of those ambiguities in the permanent appropriations is always up for grabs. It can always change. We saw a version of that, the King v. Burwell case, where there's the premium tax credit, within the statute. Well, if you say that it's up to Chevron deference, that means each administration has a switch that can turn on and off the funding. And so the best argument for permanent appropriations is actually undermined by applying deference. And that's one reason I think that doctrinally courts could not only should, but could say that it doesn't make sense with the kind of Chevron intent assumptions to defer to permanent appropriations when we should assume when there's a permanent appropriation that Congress was actually looking for the meaning to be solid over time. And of course, there's more to it than that. The bottom line core point is, let's see if I can get on there. Bear with me. Don't cross the streams. When Congress creates a statute, there's the clear law, that goes to the agency. There's the ambiguity, that might go to courts, that might go to the agency. And then there's also the funding. And when there's annual appropriations, Congress keeps that. When it's permanent, Congress is giving some of that away. When you have deference for permanent appropriations, you have all of the different kind of sources of influence created in time one when a statute is created. All of them are going to the agency in time two. There's some downsides to that. There's upsides too, we talk about in the paper, but overall, recommend courts decline Chevron deference for permanent appropriations. Love to get questions or engage further on this. I have my Twitter handle and my email on this, and look forward to the rest of the symposium.